I never thought a red envelope from my HOA would threaten to destroy my $30,000 solar panels, the same panels that ended up powering our entire neighborhood during a catastrophic blackout. This is the story of how one Karen's obsession with aesthetics nearly left hundreds stranded in darkness, and why she's now begging me to keep the lights on. It all started with a certified letter. When that envelope arrived, I honestly expected yet another mundane notice about minor infractions. Maybe a recycling bin placed an inch off the curb or a hedge trimmed unevenly. Our HOA had a reputation for nitpicking, but the bright red color of this letter was new and unsettling. Pulling it out, I saw the bold HOA logo stamped on the front. My gut twisted. Red envelopes meant something big, something urgent. Sure enough, inside was a demand: mandatory removal of unauthorized solar array. My heart hammered as I read. They wanted me to tear down the solar panels I'd installed, a project I'd spent $30,000 on and months planning. I had all the city permits, the previous HOA board's approval, and receipts from a reputable installer. Yet here I was, labeled a violator of community standards and threatened with escalating fines. The letter's language was almost hostile, like I was an outlaw for daring to harvest sunlight. Determined to straighten this out, I grabbed my binder of paperwork and headed to the HOA office. That's when I met Karen. She had a frosted blonde bob and a nameplate reading Board President resting on her desk, along with a clipboard full of violation forms. The moment I mentioned the letter, she rose, towering over me with an air of smug authority. "Oh, you're the one with the rooftop monstrosity," she said, lips curling in disdain. "Those panels violate Section 12(7). Remove them or face fines." I showed her my documentation, explaining how the previous board approved everything and that the state had pro-solar legislation safeguarding installations like mine. She barely looked at my binder before snapping it shut and handing it back. "I don't care what the old board did," she said. "I'm in charge now, and I won't let a hideous eyesore devalue our neighborhood." Before I could argue, she disappeared into a back room, leaving me standing there. In a single encounter, she'd turned my legitimate project into a personal affront. My frustration simmered as I realized I might be dealing with a professional busybody, someone who thrived on control. Over the next week, she sent daily notices, each claiming I'd violated a new bylaw. It became surreal: excessive reflectivity, unapproved exterior modification, failure to maintain community aesthetic. The notices were signed in her neat, looping signature, Karen, President. Meanwhile, local meteorologists warned that a major storm was heading our way, possibly the worst in a decade. Neighbors bustled about, stocking canned goods and water. But Karen appeared more occupied with her personal crusade. She sent me email after email demanding immediate compliance, CCing half the board. Her hostility was baffling. Here I was, with a legal installation that happened to be eco-friendly and forward-thinking, and she acted as though I'd broken into her house and rearranged her furniture. That was when I decided to double down quietly. My solar system wasn't just panels on a roof. It included a robust battery bank. Recently, I'd gotten city permission to connect this system to our neighborhood's seldom-used emergency grid. If the power went out, my panels could supply crucial circuits, refrigerators, some lighting, medical devices, to any house that opted in. It was a big reason I invested so heavily. I wanted to be prepared, and I wanted to help others if disaster struck. The storm arrived with ominous force. Rain battered the roofs, wind shrieked through the trees, and thunder rattled windows. Around midnight, the power grid failed. Streetlights flickered off, houses went dark, and an eerie silence settled in. Then my backup system kicked in, funneling stored solar power into the emergency lines. Lights flickered back on in several houses around me. Neighbors texted in disbelief. "Wait, why do I have electricity?" "Because of the so-called eyesore, that's why." My phone buzzed non-stop with people thanking me or asking how it was possible. I explained it briefly. If you signed the emergency feed form, your essential circuits were powered by my battery bank and the panels still generating energy during daylight. Our block became a small island of light in a sea of darkness. Karen's house, however, remained pitch black. She had refused to sign the emergency agreement, calling it a sham and accusing me of trying to push my illegal upgrades. Now, in the raging storm, her pride trapped her in a powerless home. By day 2, the storm raged on, toppling trees and flooding roads. The utility company announced widespread outages that could last a week or more. Meanwhile, on our street, fridges still hummed, cell phones charged, and medical devices kept people safe. Mrs. Jenkins, who relied on an oxygen machine, tearfully thanked me. The Ramirez family, with a child needing refrigerated medication, voiced their relief. Kids watched stored cartoons on tablets to keep calm, all thanks to the despised panels. Karen, rumor had it, was melting down by candlelight. A neighbor told me she'd tried to run an extension cord in the dead of night from a neighbor's yard, only to blow a fuse. Her groceries spoiled, her phone died, and she spent hours fuming about how I was lording power over the neighborhood. It was absurd to imagine anyone orchestrating a storm for petty revenge, but apparently that's what she believed. On day 3, the wind still howled, and the roads were impassable for repair crews. I made rounds to ensure each connected household had what they needed. Some neighbors needed help resetting breakers or rerouting power to specific appliances. I did what I could. Word spread about my system, and more folks asked if they could sign up too. They'd originally ignored the city's emergency feed form, not realizing it was a free protective measure. Karen, however, remained an island of resentment. Greg, our HOA treasurer, braved the downpour to knock on my door. He looked haggard, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "She's threatening to sue everyone," he said, exasperated. "She says you deliberately cut her off. She's accusing us on the board of conspiring with you. She won't listen to reason." I just shook my head. "All she has to do is sign. It's the same form everyone else did. I can't legally flip her breaker without permission." Greg sighed. "She's out of water because her well pump's down and she has no backup. She's furious, and people are worried about her mental state." We decided to give it one last try. Stomping through knee-deep puddles, we reached her porch, hammered by relentless rain. She answered the door, candlelight flickering behind her, revealing a gaunt face etched with anger. "What do you want?" she hissed, glaring at me like I was a villain in her personal drama. "Karen, please," Greg said gently. "Sign the emergency feed form. You need power. It's too dangerous to stay like this." She locked eyes with me, hatred burning. "I'd rather freeze than admit your panels are useful. But fine, if it shuts you up." She snatched the form from Greg's hand, scribbled her name, and thrust it back. "Now connect me before I change my mind." I flipped her breaker on the emergency panel, and moments later, light glowed in her windows. Relief flickered across her expression, then morphed into stubborn anger. She slammed the door without a word of thanks. By day 4, the storm showed signs of easing. Many roads remained blocked by debris, but at least the winds died down. Our neighborhood endured far better than most, thanks to the partial power from my system. People shared supplies, cooked meals, and helped each other cope. Despite Karen's tantrums, the crisis bonded the community. Kids played board games by lamplight, seniors used medical devices without fear, and families salvaged their food. When the skies finally cleared on day 7, the damage was revealed in full toppled trees, broken power lines, and waterlogged streets. Utility crews estimated another week before full restoration, but we were okay. My eyesore had kept the essentials running. Some local news outlets caught wind of our microgrid success, and a small flurry of reporters showed up once they could navigate the roads. It was almost surreal, a story about a homeowner who faced HOA opposition but ended up saving the block during a natural disaster. Karen, however, was seething. The moment city power was officially restored, she called an urgent HOA meeting to address my gross violation of community regulations. Flyers appeared in mailboxes accusing me of hijacking the neighborhood's infrastructure and blatant disregard for aesthetic standards. People rolled their eyes, but curiosity led them to attend. I spent the next few days organizing my defense. I compiled every permit, the old board's approval, the city's sign-off on the emergency grid extension, and the brand new state law that explicitly protected homeowners' rights to install renewable energy systems, despite HOA aesthetic rules. I also gathered testimonials from neighbors about how essential my system was during the blackout. If Karen wanted a grand showdown, she'd get one, complete with evidence. The community center was packed on meeting night. Folding chairs lined the room, and there wasn't an empty seat left. People stood along the walls, whispering rumors about what Karen might try. She sat up front, shoulders stiff, flanked by 2 other board members who looked exhausted from dealing with her. As soon as the clock struck 7, she cleared her throat into the microphone. "This special session," she began, "is called to address the blatant disregard of HOA bylaws concerning an unauthorized solar array installation. We must determine appropriate sanctions for this homeowner's reckless actions." A chorus of groans erupted, and I stood, holding my folder of documents. "I have here all the permits, approvals, and relevant statutes," I said, projecting my voice so even those at the back could hear. This system was greenlit by the previous board, and the city's official stamps are on every page. Furthermore, a recently passed state law supersedes aesthetic objections to solar. And as most of you know, this system provided life-saving power during the storm. I have written testimonials if anyone doubts that. Karen attempted to talk over me. Our bylaws clearly state we can regulate external modifications if they disrupt the uniform look of the neighborhood. Solar or not, it's an eyesore. But Harold, a senior board member, held up a hand. Karen, let him finish. Then we'll discuss. I passed copies of my documents to the front rows. As you'll see, everything is legal, binding, and recognized by state law. On top of that, we connected many homes to emergency power. Oxygen machines ran. Insulin stayed cold. Families kept their fridges going. If that's not in the spirit of being a good neighbor, I'm not sure what is. A wave of quiet applause spread through the audience. Some folks called out, "Thank you," or "Hear, hear." Karen's face reddened. "This isn't about your misguided hero complex," she snapped. "It's about rules. If we let one person ignore them, what's next? Neon pink paint on every house?" Greg stepped forward. "Karen, we consulted an attorney. They confirmed we can't override state solar rights. Attempting to fine or remove this installation is a losing battle, legally and financially. We'd risk serious lawsuits." Karen sputtered, scanning the crowd for support. "Property values will drop." She tried, but a neighbor piped up, "Actually, solar often raises property values. Maybe you should do your research, Karen." Laughter rippled through the room. Karen glared, but she seemed out of arguments. Finally, Harold spoke. "It's clear the homeowner followed the law. The board has no standing to impose sanctions. The emergency feed was a godsend during this crisis, and we should be grateful, not punitive." A moment of tense silence followed. Then Karen slammed her folder shut, face twisted with fury. "Fine," she barked. "Ignore the rules if you want. Don't come whining to me when the neighborhood becomes a circus." She shoved her chair back and stormed out, letting the door crash behind her. Relieved chatter erupted. People surrounded me, shaking my hand, thanking me, or asking about how they too might get solar. Mrs. Jenkins teared up again, calling me her lifesaver. Even the Ramirez family offered a plate of homemade cookies. Greg gave me a half smile, whispering, "Sorry you had to deal with all this. She's Karen." By the time I stepped outside, a vivid sunset lit the sky in oranges and pinks. It felt symbolic, like the storm and the drama had finally cleared. I walked home along streets still strewn with branches and debris, noticing how neighbors had come together to clean up. Everyone was talking excitedly about the new sense of unity. Karen's negativity had backfired, galvanizing people to appreciate the value of renewable energy. When I reached my driveway, the black glass of my panels caught the last glimmers of sunlight. I couldn't help but smile. Those ugly solar panels had not only proven their worth, but also bonded the community in an unexpected way. Karen might keep stewing, but her reign of terror was effectively over. She tried to tear me down, only to elevate the entire neighborhood's perspective on sustainable living. Inside, I set my stack of paperwork on the counter, suddenly exhausted. As my phone buzzed with more thank you messages, I reflected on the surreal chain of events. A single red envelope had sparked a feud, a record-breaking storm tested the system, and in the end, my eyesore had become a beacon of hope. Karen's vendetta was crushed under the weight of legality, practicality, and community support. Yet the story doesn't quite end there. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood's attitude toward alternative energy. A handful of people reached out, asking for details about my installer, or inquiring how much they might save if they got panels of their own. The storm had taught them the fragility of our main power grid, and my system proved that solar energy was more than a fancy trend, it was a safeguard. Greg, the HOA treasurer, even floated the idea of applying for a grant to install community-owned panels on the clubhouse, so we wouldn't rely solely on external utilities during emergencies. The same board members who'd once been on the fence about solar now saw it as a potential asset, both financially and reputationally. Meanwhile, Karen was conspicuously quiet in board meetings, likely licking her wounds and plotting her next move. But the wind had clearly shifted. One afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins called me from her landline. Her cell reception was still spotty due to the storm damage. Her voice trembled with emotion as she thanked me again. "I know you've heard this 1,000 times," she said, "but I really feel like you saved my life. My oxygen machine can't go without power for long. If you hadn't fought for those panels," I reassured her, telling her I was just glad the system worked as intended. We chatted about how the neighborhood might evolve after the storm, more preparedness plans, a better run emergency system, even a buddy program to check on vulnerable neighbors. It felt good to turn a nasty confrontation into something beneficial for everyone. Meanwhile, across the street, the Ramirez family put up a little handwritten sign, "Solar equal to lifesaver." They'd pinned it as a tongue-in-cheek homage to the nights they spent powered by my eyesore. Karen, who lived 2 blocks away, reportedly fumed at the sign's audacity, but didn't dare try removing it, especially after her fiasco at the HOA meeting. People were bolder now, less afraid of her wrath. A couple weeks later, the local news station ran a short segment on innovative responses to the storm, featuring my house as a prime example. They filmed my roof, the lines connecting to the emergency grid, and interviewed a few neighbors about their experiences. One older resident said, "If not for those panels, we'd have been in the dark for days." Karen called them an eyesore, but to me, they're beautiful. The camera cut to a close-up of the glistening panels, capturing that quietly heroic aura that had become the talk of the town. Even beyond our neighborhood, friends and coworkers asked me about solar. Did it really pay off? Was it legal to override the HOA's aesthetic preferences? I explained everything. Permits, state law, the success of the emergency feed. People seemed stunned that one person's forward-thinking move could benefit so many, especially under the shadow of a petty HOA president trying to sabotage it. Word spread, and I even heard from an old college buddy who joked that I should go on a speaking tour for solar freedom. While I didn't plan on becoming an activist, I did realize just how powerful a simple, lawful stance could be when faced with an irrational bully. Karen had banked on intimidation and obscure bylaws, never anticipating that I'd be prepared, informed, and, thanks to the storm, backed by grateful neighbors. Instead of scaring me into removing the panels, she gave me a platform to showcase their value. In a bittersweet twist, I occasionally felt a pang of empathy for Karen. She'd made herself an outcast, refusing to accept help until it was almost too late, and sacrificing her credibility on the altar of neighborhood aesthetics. Yet, even she ended up benefiting from the system she despised. In the end, her meltdown underscored a lesson for everyone. Pride can be more blinding than any reflection off a solar panel. Of course, the HOA continued to exist, and I had to deal with smaller issues, like ensuring the new signage for the emergency feed complied with standard design guidelines. But these were normal, workable challenges, not the personal vendetta Karen had unleashed. The rest of the board, chastened by her fiasco, seemed more open to constructive dialogue about community improvements. As for Karen, she largely retreated from the public stage. Rumor had it, she'd tried to rally a second wave of complaints, only to be shut down by the very board members she once commanded. Some said she was plotting a lawsuit, but no official paperwork ever materialized. Perhaps her lawyer advised her of the hopelessness of fighting state law and a well-documented solar system that had just saved so many from misery. We never did see her at the next few community events. She remained conspicuously absent, perhaps nursing her wounded pride behind closed curtains. Life moved on. The storm damage was cleared, power lines were repaired, and the hum of normalcy returned. But a quiet transformation had taken hold in the neighborhood. More people embraced the idea of resilience and self-sufficiency, and petty squabbles gave way, at least a bit, to genuine camaraderie. In an odd way, Karen's aggression catalyzed a stronger sense of unity. She wanted to isolate me and crush my solar project, but she ended up shining a spotlight on it, turning me into an unlikely champion of renewable energy. A month after the storm, the board held a casual community picnic, something we hadn't done in years. It was potluck style, with kids running around and older folks swapping stories about the blackout. Greg gave a short speech about lessons learned from the storm, praising the spirit of cooperation and forward thinking that saved us from far worse consequences. He didn't mention Karen, but everyone understood the subtext. An HOA should serve its members, not terrorize them. Standing by my table of homemade snacks, I looked at the crowd and felt genuine warmth. People were smiling, introducing themselves to neighbors they'd never met, and even discussing ways to coordinate for future emergencies. If the price of all this goodwill was enduring Karen's tantrum, it seemed a fair trade. Toward the end of the picnic, Mrs. Jenkins pulled me aside. She clasped my hand, eyes glimmering with gratitude. "I really hope you know what you did for us," she said softly. "It wasn't just about power, it was about hope. When everything went dark, your house was a reminder that we could get through it." And that's worth more than any fight over aesthetics. Her words stayed. I realized that the entire fiasco, red envelopes, threatening letters, stormy board meetings, had boiled down to a fundamental clash between someone's narrow vision of appearance and the broader community's need for safety, sustainability, and cooperation. And in that contest, the community won. So, the next time your HOA complains about ugly solar panels, smile. Remind them that when everything else fails, you'll be the one holding the power, literally. Because at the end of the day, no petty rule can overshadow the fact that, when darkness falls, it's the shining solution that saves us all.